makes me smile.
Joy of the Lord.
He makes me glad.
Joy of the Lord is my
He will
strength.
deliver me.
Oh, he's our strength when I'm weak and strong.
will save
I'm
me.
filled with his joy.
Joy of the Lord is our strength.
Welcome back to Hope for the Caregiver. This is Peter Rosenberg, and that is Gracie with Russ Taff from her CD Resilient. And I love her singing that song, The Joy of the Lord. HopeForTheCaregiver.com, HopeForTheCaregiver.com. I want to turn your attention to a very unusual story in Scripture that a lot of people may not know. Gracie was struggling the other day, and I pulled out her Bible, and I read to her from this passage in 2 Samuel. Now, let me give you some background on this. King Saul and Jonathan had been killed in battle. And now David was anointed king. You know that. And he became king, but he wasn't king of the entire nation right off the bat. Saul had another son named Mephibosheth. I think I'm saying that right. And he was proclaimed king by, I believe, Abner, one of Saul's generals. And he ruled outside of Judah. Now, David was in Judah. And Ishbosheth was sleeping, and two guys came in who had been part of his kind of mercenaries that had worked for Ishbosheth, and they killed him in his sleep. And they cut off his head. They took it to David, thinking that they were going to get a reward. Now, you remember when Saul died, he threw himself on his own sword. The servant said he wouldn't kill Saul, and Saul threw himself on his own sword and killed him. And then the servant went and told David the news, but the servant lied and took credit for it. And David killed the servant for touching the Lord's anointed. He said, your words have done this. And even though the guy didn't do it, he just lied about it in order to take credit for it. David killed him. Okay? Now, flash forward a bit of time, and Saul's other son, Jonathan's brother, Ishbosheth, was king of part of the nation. And then these two guys went in and killed him in his sleep, took off his head, and took it to David in order to curry favor with David. And David referenced back again what he did with the guy who claimed to kill Saul. And he killed those guys right there, had them killed, and cut off their hands, I believe their feet, and hung them up for everyone to see because they had gone against the king. So it didn't work out for either one of those guys. It was a pretty rough time back then. So then David assumes kingship over all of Israel. And he was musing one day, and he called in a guy named Ziba. Ziba was the servant to Saul. And he said, are any of Saul's family still alive that I may take care of them? Now, normally when a throne changed hands from a different family, they killed all the other relatives of the prior sovereign in order to make sure that they weren't threatened. Well, now David didn't want to do that. And Ziba told David about Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son. He said, now he's crippled as a child. A couple chapters later, you hear the story of how he became crippled. His nurse was fleeing with him after they'd heard that Jonathan and Saul had fallen in battle, and she dropped him as a kid and evidently broke his feet, crippled his feet somehow, and he was crippled for life. So he mentioned two times there. Now Ziba mentions that he's crippled. And then later on, they'll mention he's crippled. 4 times Scripture mentions that this guy's crippled. Now I'm reading this to Gracie. And Mephibosheth was living in a place called Lo Debar, which was translated barrenness, waste, desolation, shame. He was basically an outcast, and he was a cripple. And back in those days, they didn't have handicap accessibility. If you were a cripple up until, well, if you had any kind of mobility impairments anywhere in the world up until about 1991, life was a bit challenging for you. And he was brought before David. He said he bowed low to David. Now I want you to imagine how difficult it is for a man who is crippled to bow. And Mephibosheth had no idea what was going on. He was expecting to be treated poorly and possibly killed. That was standard operating procedure back then. And he referred to himself as a dog. He says, what do you want with me? I'm just a dog. And David did the unexpected. He told Ziba, he said, I'm giving Saul's land to Mephibosheth, and I want you and your servants, I think he had a bunch of servants and a bunch of kids, I want you to farm that land so that you can support Mephibosheth. And he's going to sit at my table and eat from my table. And for the rest of his life, that's what Mephibosheth did. You remember Jonathan and David were very close, and he honored his deep friendship with Jonathan. Mephibosheth had no idea. He was living in desolation, literally in a place called desolation. And the king sought him out. And I read this to Gracie in her hospital bed. She was having a hard day. And I looked at her and I said, now, Gracie, you know more than most what the definition of crippled is. She's missing both legs. And you have been in this hospital for weeks and weeks, and this is not your first rodeo. In a place of barrenness and despair, desolation. Her body is just broken. And I looked at my wife and I said, but the great news is your king has sought you out. He has sought you out and he has put you at his table. David honored the covenant he made with Jonathan by taking care of Jonathan's son. God made a covenant with Abraham of which we are party to now by faith. And he swore by himself because there was nothing greater that he could swear by. God swore by his own name. And I said this to Gracie, and he sought you out. That is the great news. That is the gospel. Mephibosheth was not healed. He remained crippled. 4 times Scripture mentioned that he was crippled. And if Scripture is going to repeat something that many times, we might want to pay attention to it. And why am I sharing this with you all, of what I shared with Gracie? Gracie has clear evidence of her body's infirmity. And she and I both know what it's like to live in a place of despair. We both have been there. But we also are keenly aware and require reminding that our King sought us out. We had no hope. We had nothing. And the reality is all of us are cripples living in Lodebar. We're all there. Every one of us. Whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we even realize it or not, that is the state, the hopeless state of mankind. And yet, our King sought us out. What an amazing story. There's a greater David who sought us out in our despair and puts us at his table. These are things that sustain me and Gracie in our journey. And we require reminding of it. I have caregiver amnesia. I have gospel amnesia. And I need to be reminded every day. That's why I love that old hymn. Sing them over and over again. Wonderful words of life. Beautiful words. Wonderful words of life. To remind myself. And then I say, I love to tell the story of Jesus and his love. I saw a quote the other day from Martin Lloyd-Jones, the great Welsh minister, who I don't know if you know who he is, but it would be worth your time to do some research on him. He went to St. Bart's, I think it's called, the medical school. He was a doctor by training, and that's the school where the fictional character of Sherlock Holmes went to, where they had so much forensic training. But Martin Lloyd-Jones actually went to this place and was a brilliant medical doctor who came to Christ and then went into the ministry. And he took that amazing mind of his and just left a huge body of work. And in this quote, he said, I am more than ever convinced that the trouble with many Christian people is that they do not preach to themselves. We should spend time every day preaching to ourselves. Martin Lloyd-Jones. And so what I do on this program, I want you all to know this. I preach to myself. I am constantly needing reminding and reassuring of the gospel. Not because of anything Christ omitted, but because of my fallen state. To anchor myself into that, to think on this daily, so that when my wife is despairing, that I can remind her as well that her King sought her out, even in her crippled state. And he has placed her at his table. And I would say to you, my fellow caregivers, many of you feel crippled, whether emotionally or even physically. You feel despairing. You feel broken. You feel lost. You feel shame. You feel all of those things. And you may indeed be just immersed in that. But the gospel is that your King, through nothing you've done, has sought you out. Your King has offered you a place at his table and provides for you. Doesn't mean that your challenges in this life will be evaporated and instantly overcome and done and everything's good and you're just, life is happy all the time. It doesn't mean that, because Mephibosheth lived the rest of his life crippled. But he lived the rest of his life sitting at the king's table in a place of honor. There is a greater David who has done this for you and for me. That's why I can look at Gracie and say, you will walk and not grow weary. You will run and not grow faint. May not happen in this lifetime. Doesn't appear that it will. And he will sustain us and we will endure, as I said in the last block. But his promises are true to you and to me. And we can endure. We can stay steadfast. We can cease striving. We can be at rest, knowing that our King sought us out. What a picture of the gospel. See, that's the gospel. That is the gospel. That's the good news. We have to hear the bad news. And Scripture said 4 times, the bad news, that this guy was crippled. He was in a bad place. But then the King sought him out. And that's the good news. That is the gospel. And that is hope for the caregiver. This is Peter Rosenberger. We'll be right back.